The longest promise centers on Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Price, a decorated black officer on a deeply personal mission to fulfill a promise to his fallen friend, Sergeant Ryan O'Connor. Determined to escort Ryan's body home, Elijah embarks on a journey that quickly becomes a test of endurance, as he faces racial prejudice and relentless bureaucratic obstacles at the airport. Despite his distinguished service, he's treated with suspicion, sparking a viral wave of public support as bystanders record his mistreatment. As he moves forward, Elijah's mission shifts from a private act of loyalty to a public stand against discrimination. Along the way, unexpected allies emerge, and by the time he reaches Ryan's hometown, the community is waiting in support. A final twist reveals Ryan's own awareness of the injustices Elijah would endure, reminding Elijah of the bond they shared and the battles he must continue to fight. This is a story of resilience, honor, and the power of silent courage, where a promise between two friends becomes a powerful statement against bias and a testament to unbreakable brotherhood. Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Price stood at the edge of the bustling airport terminal, his gaze distant and somber. The cacophony of hurried travelers, rolling luggage, and blaring announcements melted into a distant hum as he focused on the task ahead. In his hands, he clutched the military paperwork, the pass for the cargo area, and, most importantly, the promise he had made to Ryan O'Connor's family. Steeling himself, Elijah moved forward through the terminal, his posture rigid, his gaze steady. The heavy weight of his military uniform adorned with medals did little to shield him from the sidelong glances and murmurs around him. At the check-in counter, a young attendant looked up, and for a brief moment, a flicker of discomfort crossed her face. Elijah approached, handing over his identification and the special clearance documents. "Good morning, sir. I'm here to transport the remains of Sergeant Ryan O'Connor," he said, his voice calm but tinged with an underlying grief. The attendant's eyes darted from the documents to Elijah's face, her expression hardening slightly. "One moment, please," she said, pressing a button on the intercom. "Verification needed at counter 4, she spoke into it. Elijah raised an eyebrow, but his face remained impassive. He understood the importance of protocol, yet there was an unmistakable tension in the air that prickled at his patience. After a few minutes, another employee arrived, and together they whispered, glancing at his uniform and papers. Finally, the first attendant looked back at Elijah, her smile tight. "Just a moment, sir. We need to verify your paperwork with security." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he nodded, maintaining his composure. "Take your time," he replied, though his voice carried an edge. As the verification dragged on, he took a step back, catching his own reflection in a nearby glass panel. The dark eyes staring back at him were weary yet resolute. "Just one more mission, Eli," he told himself, remembering the words he had whispered over Ryan's casket. "I'll get you home." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the attendant returned, handing back his documents without an apology. "Thank you, Colonel Price. You may proceed." He nodded once, taking the papers, but inside, he felt the slow burn of frustration. Nevertheless, he continued, determined not to let this moment delay his promise. As he approached the security checkpoint, Elijah's steps slowed. He scanned the line, watching as travelers moved through the metal detectors. When his turn came, the officer at the scanner, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a skeptical gaze, called him aside. "Sir, we'll need to do a secondary screening," the officer said, motioning Elijah to step out of line. "I've already gone through verification at the check-in counter," Elijah replied calmly, holding up his documents. "I'm transporting a fallen soldier. I have the clearance." The officer glanced at his badge, barely acknowledging it. "It's just protocol, sir," he replied in a tone that carried little room for argument. Without a word, Elijah complied, stepping into the designated area as the officer started checking his bags. But as the officer began inspecting every item with meticulous attention, it became clear that this was more than protocol, it was scrutiny. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, but he held his tongue, watching as the officer sifted through his belongings. When the officer reached his medals, Elijah's patience frayed. He could feel the weight of the stares from other passengers and the muttered comments from onlookers. "Is that really necessary?" he asked, his voice measured but firm. The officer glanced up, giving a noncommittal shrug. "Just doing my job." After another few minutes, the inspection ended. Elijah gathered his things, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and sadness. He had faced hostility in the field, but there was something particularly bitter about facing it here, among his own people. As he moved away from security, he heard a quiet voice behind him. "That was unnecessary," a woman murmured. Elijah turned, meeting the sympathetic gaze of a petite woman with striking green eyes and auburn hair neatly pinned back. She was wearing a civilian uniform, but her posture and the sharpness in her eyes betrayed a military bearing. "Captain Sarah Talbot," she introduced herself quietly. "Retired Air Force." "Elijah Price," he replied, sensing a glimmer of understanding. She nodded slightly, her eyes narrowing as she looked back toward the security area. "They shouldn't have treated you that way," she said softly. "You deserve better." Elijah shrugged, his face hardening. "Doesn't matter," he said. "I'm here for Ryan. That's all." Talbot's gaze lingered for a moment, something unspoken in her expression. "If you need anything, Colonel, I'm around. Good luck with your mission." "Thank you, Captain." He gave her a small nod of appreciation before turning to continue his journey. Her quiet support was a balm, yet it didn't erase the bitterness in his chest. Arriving at the gate, Elijah checked the departure board. A flashing notification blinked next to his flight, delayed. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. The waiting, the scrutiny, it was all starting to weigh on him. He approached the gate agent, a young man with a bored expression, who barely glanced up as Elijah addressed him. "Excuse me, do you know the reason for the delay?" The attendant finally looked up, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "Not sure, sir. Just sit tight. We'll update you if there's any change." Elijah's patience was slipping. "I'm transporting a soldier's remains. It's essential I get on this flight as soon as possible." The attendant sighed, tapping his fingers on the counter. "Like I said, we'll let you know if anything changes." He turned his attention to the computer, effectively dismissing Elijah. Taking a deep breath, Elijah stepped back, clenching his fists as he tried to quell the frustration rising within him. "Stay focused, Eli. You're here for Ryan. Just keep going." After waiting for what felt like an eternity, Elijah decided to check on Ryan's casket in the cargo area. He followed the signs, weaving through the terminal until he reached a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." A guard stationed there gave him a suspicious glance. Elijah presented his clearance papers. "I need to confirm the transfer of my friend's casket." The guard looked over the paperwork, then back up at Elijah, skepticism written across his face. "Wait here," he said, disappearing through a door. Minutes ticked by, each one a reminder of the countless obstacles that seemed intent on testing his resolve. When the guard finally returned, he gestured for Elijah to follow. In the cargo area, the mechanical hum of machinery filled the air. Crates were stacked everywhere, and the smell of jet fuel lingered. The guard stopped by a large crate marked with Ryan's name and military ID. Elijah stepped forward, resting a hand on the edge of the crate. For a moment, all the tension and anger faded, replaced by a deep, unspoken grief. "I promised you I'd get you home, Ryan," he murmured quietly, his voice breaking. "And I will. No matter what." The guard shifted uncomfortably, glancing away to give Elijah a moment of privacy. After a silent beat, Elijah straightened, his resolve solidified once more. He nodded to the guard and turned to make his way back to the terminal, each step carrying the weight of his promise. Returning to the terminal, Elijah felt the shift in the atmosphere. Some passengers whispered, casting glances in his direction. He noticed cell phones held a bit higher than usual, pointed subtly toward him. Unfazed, he held his head high, his gaze fixed ahead. This journey was not about them, not about the scrutiny or judgment he faced. It was about Ryan, and he would see it through, no matter the obstacles. Just one more mission, Eli, he reminded himself, the words like a steadying pulse. One last promise. Elijah returned to the terminal, mentally bracing himself for the delays and frustrations that lay ahead. The whispers from onlookers were louder now, and he noticed that more people had taken out their phones, covertly filming his every step. He held his head high, ignoring the stares, but the weight of unwanted attention clung to him like a heavy cloak. As he found a seat near the gate, a young woman sitting nearby leaned over, her phone in hand. "Excuse me, sir," she said hesitantly. I saw what happened back there. It didn't seem fair." Elijah met her gaze, appreciating her concern but unwilling to engage. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm just here to fulfill a promise," he said, keeping his tone polite but firm. She nodded, though her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer. "Well, I think it's wrong. A lot of people do." She gave him a small nod before retreating to her phone, typing furiously. Moments later, Elijah noticed another figure approach, a tall, broad man with graying hair and a worn, no-nonsense expression. It was Ralph McGinnis, one of the security officers, now out of his formal stance. Ralph cleared his throat, his gaze softening as he looked down at Elijah. "Colonel Price," he greeted, his voice low. "I want to say, on behalf of myself, not the airport, that I'm sorry for the way you've been treated. It's not right, and frankly, it's shameful." Elijah's face softened as he regarded Ralph. "Thank you. It's not your fault," he replied, though a note of bitterness crept into his tone. "I'm just trying to bring my friend home." Ralph hesitated, shifting on his feet. "I served in the Marines myself. Retired now, obviously, but I understand what it means to lose a brother." His gaze drifted downward, and for a moment, the weight of his own memories seemed to hang between them. "I appreciate that," Elijah said, sincerity in his voice. "Ryan saved my life more than once. This is the least I can do for him." Ralph nodded, looking conflicted. "Look, if there's anything I can do, even if it's just getting you a decent cup of coffee, let me know. I hate to see a soldier treated like this." Elijah's mouth curved into a small smile. "I'll keep that in mind, Ralph." "Thanks." Ralph gave him a curt nod and turned to leave, casting one last glance over his shoulder as if to make sure Elijah was holding up. Elijah watched him go, the kindness a welcome reprieve from the steady stream of frustration. Not long after Ralph departed, Elijah's phone buzzed. He glanced down to see a message from Captain Sarah Talbot, "Meet me by the security office when you have a minute." Curious, Elijah made his way through the terminal, ignoring the glances and phones pointed his way. When he reached the security office, Talbot was waiting, her expression determined. "Elijah," she greeted him quietly, gesturing for him to follow her down a narrow hallway. She led him into a small, empty break room, where she turned, her eyes assessing him. "Captain," he acknowledged, giving her a respectful nod. She let out a sigh, crossing her arms. "Look, I just wanted to say that I'm keeping an eye on things. What they put you through back there? Unacceptable. I've been through my share of that nonsense myself, especially after leaving the Air Force." Elijah regarded her, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "So you understand, then," he replied, his voice softer than before. "I do," she said, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "I know how these systems work, and how they break down when someone who doesn't fit the mold walks through." She paused, as if debating something. "It's not much, but I wanted to say, you're not alone in this." A warm gratitude flickered in Elijah's gaze. "Thank you, Captain Talbot. Knowing there's someone who sees things for what they are, it helps." She nodded, her face softening. If things get worse, I'll be there. For now, just keep going. This system is built to wear people down, but you're tougher than that. Elijah chuckled dryly. I've faced a lot worse than this. Talbot's mouth quirked into a small smile. I believe that. She hesitated, then added, Take care, Colonel. Elijah nodded and turned to leave, the small exchange bolstering his resolve. When he returned to the gate, the atmosphere had shifted. A group of people had gathered nearby, murmuring among themselves and casting him glances that were no longer just curious but supportive. He realized they had likely seen footage from earlier, shared by the woman and others who had recorded his treatment. As he took his seat again, a man across the aisle leaned over, his voice low. Hey, just so you know, a lot of us are behind you, sir. It's wrong what they did to you. Elijah glanced at him, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Thank you, he replied simply, feeling the warmth of solidarity. Just then, his phone buzzed again, and he looked down to see a notification, #support Elijah Price is trending. His eyes widened, and he stared at the screen, momentarily taken aback. His mission was meant to be a solemn journey, one he intended to complete quietly. But now, it seemed to be turning into something bigger. Elijah felt a strange mixture of discomfort and gratitude, grateful for the support, but wary of the attention. Lost in thought, he didn't notice when another passenger walked up to him. She was a young woman with a resolute expression, holding her phone in her hand. Excuse me, Colonel, she said, catching his attention. My name is Kara, and I just wanted to thank you for your service, first of all. And to say I'm sorry for what you're going through. Elijah's brow furrowed. Thank you, Kara. I'm just trying to get my friend home. She nodded, her eyes sympathetic. I know. And people see that, even if they don't say it. She hesitated, glancing at her phone. I posted what I saw earlier, and it's been shared so many times. People are outraged. They're asking the airport to make things right. Elijah looked away, processing her words. This wasn't what he'd wanted, to become a symbol. But here it was, unfolding around him. He nodded at Kara, offering her a solemn smile. Thank you, Kara. But all I want is to get Ryan home. Nothing more. She nodded, sensing the weight of his words. I understand. But just know that we're here for you. People aren't going to ignore what they saw. As she walked back to her seat, Elijah felt the silent solidarity around him, a swell of support that he hadn't anticipated yet couldn't deny. Soon after, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and was surprised to see the caller ID, General Adams. Elijah, the familiar voice greeted him warmly but with an undertone of concern. General Adams, Elijah replied, straightening slightly. Good to hear from you, sir. I saw what's been happening at the airport. I've already made some calls, Colonel, to make sure this mess is resolved. No soldier should have to face this, especially not one of your record. Elijah's shoulders relaxed, though he couldn't shake the deep exhaustion settling within him. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that more than I can say. Just doing my duty, Adams replied. You're a good man, Elijah, and I know you're doing this for a brother. Hold on. They'll fix this. Thank you, sir, Elijah replied. He ended the call, feeling a rush of relief mixed with the unease that this was still far from over. As the gate agent finally announced his boarding, Elijah rose, clutching his bag tightly. As he moved toward the boarding area, Ralph McGinnis appeared, giving him a brisk nod. They're letting you through first, Colonel. Priority boarding. Elijah nodded. Thanks, Ralph. Ralph's face softened. Safe travels, sir. And, thank you for keeping your promise. Elijah met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. It's my duty. To him, and to everyone who deserves better. With that, he moved forward, feeling the eyes of the terminal on him, some with respect, some with resentment. As he stepped onto the plane, he glanced back one last time, taking in the faces of those who had stood by him. In that moment, Elijah knew that this journey was no longer just his. It was a step forward for something larger, something that he would carry with him, every step of the way, until Ryan was finally home. Elijah settled into his seat on the plane, finally able to exhale the tension he'd been carrying. The last few hours had weighed heavily on him, and though he was grateful to be one step closer to fulfilling his promise, a quiet dread lingered as he realized that his mission had become a public matter. He shifted in his seat, glancing out the window as passengers filled the cabin. Just as he was about to close his eyes, a woman across the aisle caught his attention. She looked to be in her 30s, with a warm smile that cut through the fatigue clouding his mind. "Excuse me," she said, leaning over. "I just wanted to say, I've been following what happened. My family is military, and seeing how they treated you was heartbreaking. Thank you for everything you're doing, for your friend and for the rest of us." Elijah managed a polite nod, though the weight of her words pressed against his tired resolve. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm just doing what any friend would." "Well, it means a lot. People are rallying behind you, Colonel," she said. "You've got more support than you know." As she leaned back, Elijah couldn't help but feel the unease deepen. He hadn't asked for this spotlight. His mission was meant to be a final act of loyalty, a promise he would fulfill with quiet determination. But now, it seemed to carry the weight of a cause he hadn't meant to champion. Hours later, the plane landed, and Elijah made his way through the airport, following signs to baggage claim. A quick text came in from Captain Talbot, who'd been keeping tabs on him. "They're waiting outside for you, Colonel. Be prepared." Elijah frowned. "Who's waiting?" A moment later, her reply came, "Reporters. And others. They've been gathering since you took off." Elijah let out a long sigh. "I understand. Thanks for the heads up." As he made his way to the exit, he braced himself for what was to come. The sliding doors parted, and he stepped outside into a wave of camera flashes and voices that blended into a chaotic chorus. "Colonel Price." "Over here," shouted one reporter, shoving a microphone toward him. "Elijah, can you comment on your treatment at the previous airport?" asked another, her voice laced with urgency. Elijah raised his hand, signaling them to step back. "I'm here on a personal mission. I don't have any statements to make." The reporters persisted, their questions piling on top of one another. "Do you feel this is part of a larger problem with the system? What do you have to say about the public outcry? Do you think this will make any real change?" Elijah clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. He glanced around, noticing a small group of supporters standing just beyond the reporters, holding signs that read, "Justice for Elijah and respect our soldiers." Their presence stirred something within him, a sense of gratitude mixed with frustration. He hadn't asked for any of this attention, yet here it was, inescapable. Just then, a familiar face emerged from the crowd, Captain Sarah Talbot. She stepped forward, her expression calm and resolute. "Back up, everyone. Give him some space," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of a seasoned officer. The reporters hesitated, and in that brief pause, she guided Elijah away from the mob and into a quieter corner. "Thank you, Captain," Elijah said, his voice heavy with relief. Talbot gave him a nod. "They're relentless, aren't they? I didn't think it would get this big." Elijah sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Neither did I. I just wanted to bring Ryan home. Now it feels like I'm carrying a banner I never asked for." She studied him, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, Colonel, the banner chooses you. You didn't seek this fight, but maybe it found you because you're the one who can carry it." Elijah's gaze dropped, her words settling heavily on his mind. "All I want is to honor my friend," he said quietly. "I understand. But know this, your fight is showing people something important. You're standing up for more than just yourself. He nodded, his resolve hardening. I appreciate what you're saying, but I need to keep focused. Ryan's family is expecting me. Talbot offered a small, understanding smile. I'll help you however I can. If you need to get through this crowd, I can clear a path. That would mean a lot. Thank you, Sarah. Together, they moved through the crowd, Talbot guiding him with practiced efficiency. As they approached the car waiting to take Elijah to Ryan's hometown, another voice called out. Colonel Price. It was a young man, his face earnest and determined. You're an inspiration to so many of us. Thank you for standing up. Elijah paused, giving the man a small nod before slipping into the back seat of the car. As it pulled away from the crowd, he leaned back, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. He was grateful for the support, but the journey felt increasingly overwhelming, as if it was spiraling into something he couldn't control. The drive to Ryan's hometown was quiet, with only the low hum of the engine filling the car. Elijah spent the time mentally preparing for the moment he would face Ryan's family. Memories of their time together surfaced, moments of laughter, camaraderie, and the unbreakable bond forged on the battlefield. The car slowed as they entered the town, a small, close-knit community where American flags lined the streets and quaint houses stood in rows. Elijah's gaze softened as they approached Jessica O'Connor's home, a modest house with a warm light glowing from the front window. He stepped out of the car, taking a moment to gather himself. Then, with steady steps, he walked up the front porch and knocked on the door. A moment later, Jessica opened the door, her face etched with sorrow and a gentle strength. She looked up at Elijah, her eyes shining with a mixture of grief and gratitude. Colonel Price, she said softly, reaching out to clasp his hand. Thank you for coming. It's my honor, ma'am, Elijah replied, his voice thick with emotion. He was my brother in every way that mattered. Jessica nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. He spoke so highly of you, Elijah. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, he'd trust no one else to bring him home. Elijah swallowed, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his heart. I made him a promise. And I intend to keep it. Jessica led him into the house, where the living room was filled with photos of Ryan as a child, as a young man, and in his military uniform, his easy smile a constant. Elijah looked at each one, feeling the familiar pang of loss mixed with pride. He always wanted to make a difference, Jessica said, her voice breaking slightly. He believed in kindness, in treating everyone with respect. It's why he joined. Elijah nodded, his gaze still on the photos. He did make a difference. He saved lives, mine included. He was a good man, Mrs. O'Connor. One of the best. They sat together, the silence filled with shared memories and the profound sorrow of a life lost too soon. After a while, Jessica spoke, her voice tentative. I saw what happened at the airport, she said quietly. The way they treated you, it isn't right. Ryan would have been heartbroken to see that. Elijah looked down, his jaw clenched. I didn't want any of this attention. I just wanted to do right by Ryan. But now, it feels like it's out of my hands. Jessica placed a comforting hand on his. Sometimes, the world needs to see what one person's courage can do. Ryan believed in standing up, and I believe he'd be proud of you for standing up now, even if it wasn't by choice. Her words settled over him like a balm, soothing the turmoil that had built within him. He gave her a small nod, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. After a while, Jessica took a small, sealed letter from a drawer. She held it out to him, her hands trembling slightly. Ryan wrote this before his last deployment. He wanted you to have it, in case you're here now. Elijah accepted the letter, his heart pounding as he held the last words of his friend. He looked up at Jessica, his voice barely a whisper. Thank you. I'll cherish this. She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He loved you like a brother, Elijah. And I know he's watching over us now. As he left her home, Elijah felt a quiet resolve settling over him. He would fulfill his promise to Ryan, no matter how public or difficult the journey became. And in that moment, he knew that his mission, though altered, was far from over. The morning sun cast a soft glow over Ryan's hometown, highlighting the quiet streets and the gentle hills that framed the landscape. Elijah stood outside the small inn where he'd stayed the night, the early chill a sharp reminder of the long day that lay ahead. Today, he would accompany Ryan's family to the cemetery, a solemn procession he had promised himself he'd complete, regardless of the obstacles. Elijah took a deep breath, the letter Jessica had given him weighing heavily in his pocket. He hadn't brought himself to read it yet, knowing it would only deepen the emotions he was already struggling to keep in check. He'd read it once his mission was complete. As he stepped down the inn's stone path, a familiar face greeted him, Ralph McGinnis, the airport security officer. Ralph stood beside a small, modest car, arms crossed and expression serious. "Morning, Colonel," Ralph greeted with a nod, his voice rough but sincere. "Ralph? I didn't expect to see you here," Elijah said, surprised. "I thought you'd be back at the airport." Ralph shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. "I pulled a few strings, took a couple days off. Figured you could use a hand with all this." Elijah gave him an appreciative nod, a rare smile breaking through. "It's good to see a familiar face. Thanks for coming." Ralph grunted, waving a dismissive hand. "Don't mention it. Just doing what's right. And besides, this journey of yours has become something bigger, Colonel. People are talking, and a lot of them aren't happy with how things went down." Elijah's smile faded, his expression growing somber. "That was never my intention, Ralph. I'm just trying to honor Ryan's memory." "I get it," Ralph replied, his eyes softening. "But sometimes, you don't get to choose what a mission becomes. You're carrying something important here, Colonel, even if you didn't sign up for it." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Ralph's words settling over them. Elijah nodded slowly. "Let's get going, then. I want to be there early to make sure everything is set." The cemetery was a short drive away, and by the time they arrived, a small group of people had already gathered. Jessica stood near the front, her face etched with sorrow but a quiet strength in her posture. She approached as Elijah stepped out of the car, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you for being here, Elijah," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "I wouldn't be anywhere else, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. As they spoke, Ralph helped to organize the small crowd that had gathered, many of whom held small American flags or military memorabilia. Elijah noted the respect in their faces, the quiet reverence that reminded him of the deep ties a community like this held for their fallen. A young woman approached, holding a small notepad. She introduced herself as Kelly, a local reporter, her eyes kind but tinged with the seriousness of her role. "Colonel Price, I was wondering if you'd be open to a brief interview," she asked, her voice gentle. "I understand today is deeply personal, but I think the people would want to hear from you." Elijah hesitated, glancing at Jessica, who gave him an encouraging nod. "All right," he replied, nodding at Kelly. "But just a few questions." She gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you, Colonel. I'll keep it short." She flipped open her notepad, pen poised. "First, I just want to say, on behalf of this town, that we're all grateful for what you're doing. Ryan was a beloved member of this community, and having you here, well, it means a lot to everyone." Elijah nodded, his throat tight. "Ryan was more than a friend. He was a brother to me. We were there for each other through the worst of it, and he saved my life more than once. Bringing him home is the least I can do." Kelly jotted down his words, her gaze earnest. "Thank you, Colonel. And I know this is a bit off topic, but many people have seen what you went through to get here. The videos have been widely shared, and there's a lot of public support. What would you say to those people? Elijah's jaw clenched slightly, and he took a moment to gather his thoughts. I'd say thank you, but this isn't about me. It's about Ryan and honoring his memory. Whatever attention this journey has brought is secondary to the promise I made to his family. Kelly nodded, seeming to understand the boundaries he'd set. Thank you, Colonel. I won't keep you any longer. As she stepped away, Ralph joined Elijah, casting a look toward the small crowd. They're here for you, Colonel. And for Ryan. Elijah gave a small nod, his gaze sweeping over the faces around him. The people of this town hadn't forgotten their own, and their presence here was a testament to Ryan's legacy. The somber pride in their eyes was a reminder of why he'd come all this way. A few hours later, the group gathered near the gravesite. The cemetery was peaceful, with rows of white headstones standing in quiet tribute to the town's fallen heroes. Elijah stood beside Jessica and Ralph, his hands clasped behind his back as he waited for the service to begin. As the officiant spoke, Elijah felt the ache of loss deepening. His mind drifted back to memories of Ryan, their late-night conversations under the desert sky, the laughter that had helped them through the darkest days, and the unwavering loyalty they had shared. Finally, it was his turn to speak. He stepped forward, his voice strong but thick with emotion. Ryan O'Connor was a man who lived for others, Elijah began, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. He believed in kindness, in fairness, and in treating everyone with respect. On the battlefield, he was the kind of man you wanted by your side, and in life, he was the kind of friend you could trust with anything. Elijah paused, his throat tightening. Ryan saved my life more times than I can count. And he did it without question, without hesitation. Bringing him home was my way of repaying a debt I can never fully repay. As he spoke, a quiet murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Jessica wiped away a tear, her gaze fixed on Elijah with unwavering gratitude. Today, we lay him to rest, knowing that he gave everything he had for the people he loved. And I will carry his memory with me, every day, as a reminder of what true friendship and loyalty mean. Elijah stepped back, his heart heavy but resolute. As he returned to his place, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Ralph, who gave him a solemn nod. That was well said, Colonel, Ralph murmured. He'd have been proud. Elijah nodded, the weight of Ralph's words settling over him. Thank you, Ralph. And thank you for being here. It's meant a lot. Ralph gave him a tight smile. I wouldn't have missed it. After the service, Elijah found a quiet moment to himself near Ryan's gravesite. The crowd had begun to disperse, and only a few close friends and family members lingered nearby. He pulled the letter from his pocket, the one Jessica had given him, and carefully unfolded it. In Ryan's familiar handwriting, the words flowed with a mixture of warmth and unspoken wisdom. Eli. If you're reading this, it means you kept your promise. You always were a man of your word, and I couldn't have asked for a better friend. You got me home, brother, and that's all I ever wanted. But if I know you, you're carrying more than just my memory. You're carrying the weight of a world that isn't always fair. I saw it, Eli. I saw how they treated you and others who don't fit the mold. It wasn't right, and I tried to do my part. But now, it's your turn. Don't just bring me home, Eli. Keep fighting the battles I couldn't. Show them the strength and courage I saw every day. You've got this, brother. I know you do. Forever in your corner. Ryan. Elijah closed his eyes, the words searing into his heart. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it back into his pocket as he stood beside Ryan's grave. As he looked out over the cemetery, the quiet pride in the faces around him, he knew his journey was far from over. He had brought Ryan home, but he carried a responsibility beyond that, a mission that was just beginning. Standing there, he made a silent vow. He would continue Ryan's fight, not just for himself but for every soldier, every person, who had faced unspoken bias and prejudice. He would honor his friend's legacy, carrying it forward one step at a time. With a final glance at the headstone, he whispered, "I won't let you down, Ryan. I promise." Elijah spent the rest of the afternoon with Ryan's family, sharing stories and memories that brought both laughter and tears. By evening, the town had organized a small, informal gathering at the community center in Ryan's honor. It was a place Ryan had often mentioned, a simple building with worn wooden floors and pictures of local heroes lining the walls. To Elijah, it felt like the perfect place to celebrate his friend's life. As he entered the hall, the low murmur of voices filled the air. Neighbors, childhood friends, and veterans from nearby towns had all gathered, each person offering condolences and sharing stories of Ryan's kindness and bravery. Elijah moved through the crowd, greeting people, thanking them for their support, and quietly absorbing the warmth of the community that had raised his friend. A woman approached him, her face familiar from earlier in the day. It was Kelly, the reporter who'd spoken to him before the service. She offered him a gentle smile as she came up beside him. "Colonel Price," she greeted, "I know you've had a long day, but would you be open to saying a few words? The community would really appreciate it." Elijah hesitated, glancing around the room. He wasn't one for speeches, especially when the focus of the night was supposed to be Ryan. But he could see the expectant faces around him, each person looking at him with a mix of respect and hope. "All right," he said, nodding. "I'll say a few words." Kelly's smile widened with gratitude, and she gestured to a small stage at the front of the room. Elijah took a deep breath as he stepped up, glancing at the crowd before him, their faces reflecting the quiet strength of a town that had given him one of his closest friends. "Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady but low. Ryan would have been humbled by this gathering. He would have downplayed his own worth, said it was too much. But that was who he was, a man who lived for others, who gave without expecting anything in return. The crowd nodded, murmurs of agreement echoing through the room. Elijah paused, collecting his thoughts. "I was honored to serve beside Ryan, to fight alongside him, and to know him as a friend and brother. He was brave, he was compassionate, and he was fiercely loyal. I owe him my life, and bringing him home was the least I could do." As he spoke, his voice thickened, the weight of the journey pressing on him. "But what I realized through this experience, is that it wasn't just about fulfilling a promise. It became about standing up for him, for the values he held dear, and for every person who has faced unfairness along the way. Ryan fought for equality and justice. Now, in his memory, I'll carry that fight forward." The crowd grew quiet, absorbing his words. Elijah could see the resolve in their faces, the shared understanding that Ryan's legacy was not just in his service but in his dedication to making the world a fairer place. He stepped down, feeling both exhausted and relieved. As he made his way through the crowd, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Captain Sarah Talbot standing beside him, her expression one of quiet pride. "That was a good speech, Colonel," she said, her voice warm. "I think Ryan would have been proud." Elijah nodded, his voice soft. "Thank you, Captain. I don't usually enjoy being in the spotlight, but it felt right." Talbot smiled. "Sometimes, doing what feels right is the best way to honor someone." As the evening drew to a close, the townspeople began to gather in small groups, exchanging stories about Ryan. Elijah joined them, laughing as he heard about Ryan's high school antics and the mischief he'd gotten into as a teenager. The warmth of the community surrounded him, offering a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. Early the next morning, Elijah prepared to head back to the airport for his return flight. As he was packing up his things at the inn, his phone rang. He glanced down and saw General Adams's name on the screen. "General," Elijah answered, feeling a pang of gratitude for the man's unwavering support throughout this ordeal. Elijah, the general's familiar voice greeted him. I just wanted to check in, see how you're holding up. I'm managing, sir, Elijah replied. It's been a long journey, but we laid Ryan to rest, and that's what matters. There was a pause on the other end, and when General Adams spoke again, his tone was both serious and reflective. You've done more than just lay him to rest, Colonel. You've brought a lot of attention to issues that have gone unaddressed for too long. People are watching, and they're looking to you as a leader in this. Elijah hesitated, the weight of the general's words settling over him. I didn't intend to become a spokesperson, sir. I just wanted to honor my friend. I know, and that's precisely why people are rallying behind you. Because they see the sincerity in what you're doing, the general replied. If you're willing, there's a role for you in continuing this work, an opportunity to help address bias in the military system. Elijah took a deep breath, considering the offer. Part of him longed for a quiet return to his duties, to slip back into the familiar rhythm of his life. But another part of him, the part that had felt the sting of prejudice firsthand, recognized the importance of what General Adams was proposing. I appreciate the offer, sir, Elijah said finally. I need some time to think it over, but I won't walk away from something that matters this much. The general's voice softened. Take all the time you need, Colonel. Just know that whatever you decide, you have my full support. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. As the call ended, Elijah pocketed his phone, the general's words echoing in his mind. He knew that accepting this role would mean stepping into a new kind of battle, one that would demand a different kind of courage. But for Ryan, and for everyone who had ever felt unseen or unheard, it was a battle worth considering. Arriving back at the airport, Elijah found the terminal bustling with the usual chaos. As he moved through the lines and security checks, he noticed a familiar figure ahead of him in line, Ralph McGinnis. Ralph turned, spotting Elijah with a wide grin. Colonel. Just the man I was hoping to run into. Headed back home? Elijah nodded, shaking Ralph's hand. That's right. Thank you for everything, Ralph. Your support meant more than you know. Ralph shrugged, his grin turning serious. It's the least I could do. We've all faced those moments of unfairness, but watching you take a stand. That's something a lot of us needed to see. Elijah nodded, his respect for Ralph deepening. Then maybe this journey was bigger than just me and Ryan. Maybe it was something meant to be shared. Ralph's eyes gleamed with pride. Well, Colonel, whatever comes next, just know you've got allies. You've shown all of us that we don't have to stand alone. As they prepared to board, a few other passengers glanced their way, offering Elijah nods of respect. He noticed one man, a young soldier in uniform, giving him a crisp salute. Elijah returned the gesture, a quiet acknowledgement of the solidarity that had formed around him. Back on the plane, Elijah found his seat and settled in, feeling the familiar weight of the letter from Ryan resting in his jacket pocket. He hadn't let himself reread it yet, but its words had been echoing in his mind since he'd first unfolded it by Ryan's grave. The flight attendants began the pre-flight instructions, and as Elijah leaned back in his seat, he found himself closing his eyes, reflecting on the journey ahead. Ryan's voice seemed to echo in his mind, his words from the letter a gentle reminder, keep fighting the battles I couldn't. Show them the strength and courage I saw every day. As the plane lifted off, Elijah felt a quiet sense of peace. He hadn't planned on taking up a new mission. He hadn't planned on being a symbol of change. But perhaps that was exactly why he had been chosen. Ryan had seen something in him that he was only now beginning to understand, a strength to carry forward, to stand not just for himself but for those who couldn't. With a renewed sense of purpose, Elijah opened his eyes and looked out the window, watching as the landscape below receded. He had a long journey ahead, but this time, he knew exactly why he was taking it. And with Ryan's memory guiding him, he was ready for whatever battles lay ahead. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of media attention, messages from supporters, and an endless stream of calls and emails from advocacy groups and military organizations. Elijah hadn't anticipated the intensity of public interest after his journey with Ryan, and while he felt honored, he also felt overwhelmed. The general's offer, to work on issues of bias and equality within the military, hung over him like a question he didn't yet know how to answer. One rainy afternoon, Elijah found himself back at Fort Bragg, walking across the training grounds where he and Ryan had once run drills. The familiar landscape brought a bittersweet ache, a reminder of the quiet camaraderie and trust they'd shared. As he passed by a group of young soldiers in training, he couldn't help but feel Ryan's absence more keenly than ever. Lost in thought, he didn't notice Captain Talbot approaching until she called his name. "Elijah." She jogged over, her face lighting up with a warm smile. "I was hoping I'd see you here." "Sarah," he replied, returning the smile, grateful to see a friendly face. "What brings you out here?" She shrugged, her smile fading as she took in his expression. "I figured you'd need someone to talk to, given everything you're dealing with. It's not every day a quiet officer becomes a national symbol for justice." Elijah chuckled, though there was a weariness in his laugh. "I didn't sign up for this, Sarah. I just wanted to keep my promise to Ryan." "I know," she replied gently. "But sometimes, life has a way of giving us responsibilities we didn't ask for. And I think you know, deep down, that this is something you're meant to do." He looked away, watching the young recruits as they tackled an obstacle course, their energy and enthusiasm a stark contrast to the exhaustion that weighed on him. "The general asked me to consider taking on a formal role, working to address bias within the military. I'd be advocating for the same values Ryan stood for." "And how do you feel about that?" she asked, studying him carefully. Elijah took a deep breath, the answer a mixture of fear and conviction. "I know it's important. And after everything that happened, everything I went through to bring Ryan home, it's hard to ignore that there's work to be done." Talbot nodded, a look of admiration in her eyes. "If anyone's suited for it, Elijah, it's you. But you don't have to make this decision alone." He gave her a thoughtful look, her words giving him a sense of calm he hadn't felt in days. "Thanks, Sarah. I've been so wrapped up in what everyone else expects that I haven't taken the time to ask myself what I really want." She smiled. "Then take the time. And know that, whatever you decide, you'll have people like me backing you up." Elijah nodded, feeling a renewed sense of clarity. "I think I'll need it." "Thank you, Sarah. Really." A few days later, Elijah found himself standing before a room of local veterans, many of whom had come to hear about his experience and offer their support. It was a modest gathering, familiar faces from the community, retired officers who had heard about his journey, and younger veterans eager to connect. As he looked out over the group, he realized that this was where the real work would begin, not in the grand gestures but in the small, earnest conversations and connections. An older man raised his hand, a weathered Marine with a deep voice. "Colonel Price, you've shown us that the military has a long way to go. But what do you think can actually change?" Elijah took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "It starts with acknowledgement. Too often, we dismiss or minimize what doesn't directly impact us, but that doesn't mean the issues aren't real. I faced barriers not because of my rank but because of who I am. And I know I'm not the only one." Another veteran, a woman in her 30s, spoke up. "But how do we move forward from here? How do we actually make things better?" Elijah looked around, meeting the eyes of each person. "By taking responsibility, and by standing together. I learned something on my journey with Ryan. Sometimes, people just need one person willing to speak up, to show them they're not alone. It takes a village, and if we want real change, we have to be that village for each other." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Slowly, heads nodded, and he felt a powerful sense of unity in the room, a shared commitment to the values Ryan had upheld. After the meeting, as people filed out, a young man approached Elijah, his expression earnest. "Colonel, my father served with you. He always talked about how fair and brave you were. He passed a few years back, but he would have been proud of you." Elijah's heart tightened, the sincerity in the young man's voice hitting him deeply. "Thank you. That means more than you know," he replied, shaking the man's hand. As he left the meeting, he felt a quiet sense of resolve settling over him. Ryan's voice echoed in his memory, his friend's words from the letter, "Keep fighting the battles I couldn't." Elijah knew that he was ready to do just that. The next day, Elijah called General Adams, who answered almost immediately. "Colonel Price," the general greeted him warmly. "I hope this means you've reached a decision." Elijah took a steadying breath, a quiet certainty in his voice. "Yes, sir. I'd be honored to take on the role you offered." A note of satisfaction crept into the general's tone. "Good to hear, Colonel. This is important work, and I have no doubt that you'll make a real difference." "I'll give it everything I have," Elijah replied, feeling a swell of pride tempered with humility. "I owe it to those who came before me, and to those who deserve better." "Then let's get to work," Adams said, his voice full of resolve. As he ended the call, Elijah felt a profound sense of purpose, a clarity that had been missing since the day he promised to bring Ryan home. Now, he had a new mission, one that honored his friend's memory while making a tangible impact. A few months later, Elijah found himself standing at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a room of military personnel, advocates, and media. This was his first public statement in his new role, and though the lights and cameras were daunting, he held his head high, remembering why he was here. "Today," he began, his voice steady, "we are standing together not only to honor the sacrifices of those who serve but to recognize the responsibilities we carry. The military is a place of courage, loyalty, and resilience. But it must also be a place of fairness, where every soldier, regardless of race, background, or beliefs, is treated with respect." He glanced around the room, seeing the attentive faces before him, some familiar, some new. "My journey began with a promise to a fallen friend. That promise was to bring him home with dignity and respect. But along the way, I discovered that there are battles we still need to fight here, at home, to ensure that dignity and respect extend to every service member." There was a murmur of agreement, a quiet ripple of support. "As I move forward in this role, I promise to continue Ryan's fight, to advocate for change that reflects the values we all swore to protect. This work will not be easy, and it won't be quick. But together, we can make sure that every soldier who serves does so in an environment where they are valued and respected." The applause that followed was warm, genuine, and Elijah felt a wave of gratitude and determination. He'd started this journey for Ryan, and now, he was ready to see it through for everyone who served. That evening, as he sat alone in his office, Elijah reached into his desk and pulled out the letter Ryan had written. He read it once more, his friend's words a quiet reminder of why he had taken on this mission. "I'm doing this for you, Ryan," he whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. "And for everyone who deserves what you believed in." With renewed resolve, he carefully folded the letter, placing it back in his desk. He knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but he felt ready, grounded by the memory of his friend and inspired by the values they had shared. And as he looked out the window, seeing the lights of the city that held so many hopes, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be.